The land between rivers. You find yourself standing in the heart of an ancient land known as Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. Here the Tigris and Euphrates carve their silver paths through fertile plains, feeding the oldest civilizations known to humankind. It is a world of rising ziggurats and whispering reeds of clay tablets pressed with cuneiform script. In this vast expanse of early empire where Sumerians, Akkadians, and Assyrians once ruled, a new power is stirring Babylon. By the late 7th century, before the Common Era, Babylon was already old. It had been rebuilt and destroyed more than once, its walls toppled by Assyrians, its temples plundered, its people scattered. Yet through it all, Babylon endured. The city's spirit, its devotion to the god Marduk, its pride in its artisans and scholars never faded. When the Assyrian Empire began to falter under the weight of rebellion and invasion, Babylon waited for its moment to rise again. That moment came with a man named Nabopolassar, a Chaldean from the southern reaches of Mesopotamia, who led a revolt against Assyrian domination and established what history calls the Neo-Babylonian Empire. It is from Nabopolassar's bloodline that one of history's most formidable kings would be born, Nebuchadnezzar II. Around 634 BCE in the city of Babylon, a prince entered the world destined to shape empires. His early years were spent among priests, generals, and scribes, learning the delicate balance between piety and power. He would have studied mathematics and astronomy, the languages of diplomacy, and the sacred hymns to Marduk that every ruler was expected to know by heart. Even as a young man, Nebuchadnezzar was described as intelligent, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to his father's cause. The land around him was a tapestry of rival kingdoms. To the west lay the Egyptians, still proud under Pharaoh Necho II. To the north, remnants of Assyrian armies clung to life. To the east, Median horsemen eyed Mesopotamia's riches. And in the middle, like a heart between arteries, pulsed Babylon, newly reborn and hungry for greatness. As Nabopolassar consolidated his power, he began campaigns to drive the last Assyrian forces from Mesopotamia. His son Nebuchadnezzar quickly proved himself a capable commander. Sources suggest that even in his youth he showed an unusual combination of military discipline and architectural vision. He not only understood how to destroy cities, but how to rebuild them stronger. This dual nature, the warrior and the builder, would define his reign. The Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar's youth was not yet the grand city it would become. Streets were uneven walls in disrepair, and the great ziggurat Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, still awaited restoration. Merchants from across the Fertile Crescent passed through its gates bringing goods and gossip from distant lands. Babylon was the meeting point of many peoples, Akkadians, Arameans, Jews, Persians and Medes, each bringing their own gods and traditions. It was both a city of faith and a city of trade, and its king was expected to embody both the divine and the practical. Religion formed the foundation of life. The Babylonians believed that their gods dwelled among them, particularly in temples that served as earthly homes of the divine. Chief among these was Marduk, the city's patron deity, a god of creation, order, and judgment. Kings were seen as chosen by Marduk to maintain balance in the world. Every victory in war, every irrigation canal, every act of justice was attributed to divine favor. From an early age, Nebuchadnezzar would have been taught that his authority came not from birth alone, but from the will of the gods. As he matured, Nebuchadnezzar's talents became impossible to ignore. Nabopolassar entrusted him with increasingly difficult military campaigns, sending him to command troops across the western provinces. The young prince led with precision and caution. He studied the terrain, the morale of his men, and the tactics of his enemies. Chroniclers describe his ability to combine bold action with careful planning, a balance that few generals achieved. The soldiers of Babylon came to revere him, and the nobles began to see in him the makings of a future king. Meanwhile, in the halls of Babylon, astronomers tracked the stars, scribes recorded omens, and builders laid foundations for new temples. The city buzzed with a sense of awakening. Nabopolassar's revolution had freed them from the yoke of Assyria, but it was Nebuchadnezzar who would carry the empire beyond survival toward supremacy. The gods, the priests said, had placed the Chaldean dynasty under a favorable constellation. By the year 610 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire had become a formidable force. Together with their allies, the Medes, they destroyed the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, ending centuries of Assyrian dominance. Babylon was no longer a vassal, it was master of the lands between the rivers. But empires once begun do not rest. There were still enemies to face, territories to secure, and prestige to win. It was in these years of transition between his father's victories and his own future campaigns that Nebuchadnezzar began to dream of empire. He envisioned Babylon not just as a city of bricks and gates, but as the center of the world. The rivers would flow toward it, the caravans would converge upon it, and kings would kneel before its golden idols. He believed that through him the gods intended to restore the world's balance. This belief gave Nebuchadnezzar both confidence and purpose. He saw conquest not as cruelty, but as divine correction. To defy Babylon was in his mind to defy the order of the universe. To obey it was to share in the harmony of the gods. This worldview would shape his wars, his building projects, and even his moments of madness in later years. By the end of Nabopolassar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had become his father's most trusted commander. The old king had laid the foundation for a dynasty, but it was his son who would raise the walls, polish the stones, and engrave the glory of Babylon into history itself. Soon the prince would face his greatest test, a clash that would determine the fate of empires and confirm Babylon's supremacy over the ancient world. The battle was coming, and Nebuchadnezzar was ready. The rise of the Chaldean king. The dawn of a new era glowed over the Euphrates as the armies of Babylon gathered once more beneath banners stitched with the roaring lion of Marduk. Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar, now stood at the head of a force that stretched across the plain's ranks of archers, charioteers, and spearmen armored in bronze and leather. Each man knew that they followed a prince whose ambition burned as bright as the sun on the desert horizon. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was young, its roots still shallow in the soil of old Mesopotamia. Yet already it was proving a power that could not be ignored. Nabopolassar, the founder, had torn the Assyrian yoke from Babylon's neck. Now, as his health waned and age weighed upon him, he entrusted his son with the sacred duty of securing their empire's future. The task was vast: to defend what they had won, to restore what was lost, and to strike down any who dared challenge Babylon's rise. In the early 600s BCE, the world was a chessboard of rival powers. To the west lay Egypt, proud and ancient, ruled by Pharaoh Necho II, who sought to revive the glory of the Nile and to fill the vacuum left by the Assyrian collapse. To the north, the Medes watched cautiously from their mountain strongholds, allies now but potential rivals in time. And between them and the fertile crescent of Syria and Palestine, smaller kingdoms, Judah, Phoenicia, and remnants of Assyrian loyalists shifted uneasily in the storm's path. Nebuchadnezzar understood the delicate balance of this moment. Victory could make Babylon the unquestioned ruler of the Near East. Failure could plunge it back into chaos. He was not content to rest on his father's achievements. He would prove himself the equal of Sargon and Ashurbanipal, of Hammurabi, and the mighty kings whose names still echoed in the temples. His first tests came swiftly. As the Assyrian Empire fell apart, Egyptian forces swept northward, hoping to claim the ruins for themselves. Necho II's armies marched up the coast, taking fortified cities and establishing garrisons along the Levant. It was there, near the great bend of the Euphrates, that Babylon's destiny would be decided. Before the grand confrontation, Nebuchadnezzar led a series of smaller campaigns to secure the loyalty of neighboring provinces. He struck through Aram and Phoenicia, bringing their city-states under Babylonian rule. Some surrendered willingly, offering tribute and oaths. Others resisted and were subdued by force. Each victory brought new wealth and resources. Each submission added strength to Babylon's growing network of allies. Yet Nebuchadnezzar was more than a conqueror. He was also a strategist. He maintained supply routes with precision, restored old canals to keep his armies fed, and kept the priesthood of Marduk close, ensuring divine favor accompanied every campaign. Babylonian chronicles record that he prayed before every major battle, not for mercy but for justice, as he saw it that Babylon should lead all nations. By 605 BCE, the conflict that would define Nebuchadnezzar's early reign was at hand. Pharaoh Necho's army had marched far up the Euphrates, joining forces with the remnants of Assyria near a city called Carchemish. There, on the great northern trade route, the two powers hoped to halt Babylon's advance. Nabopolassar, old and weary, could no longer lead in person, and so command fell to his son. The fate of the empire now rested on Nebuchadnezzar's shoulders. Before the campaign began, the prince is said to have stood before the statue of Marduk, hands raised in solemn vow. He promised to fight not for glory, but for the divine order to bring peace through power. Such vows were not mere ceremony in Babylon. They were binding contracts between mortal and God. When the Babylonian army marched north, the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath its weight. Chroniclers later described columns of soldiers stretching as far as the eye could see, chariots glinting in the sun's siege engines, creaking drums echoing across the plains. Scouts rode ahead carrying messages of movement and omen. Nebuchadnezzar led from the front, his armor inlaid with copper and gold, his chariot adorned with symbols of Ishtar, goddess of war and victory. As he approached the walls of Carchemish, the air was thick with tension. The Egyptians were experienced warriors, disciplined, fierce, and guided by the prestige of an ancient civilization. Yet Nebuchadnezzar had something greater momentum purpose, and the belief that Marduk's blessing was upon him. The battle that followed would become legend, but that story belongs to another part of this tale. For now, what matters is that this young commander, still not yet a king, had brought Babylon to the threshold of greatness. Even as his armies prepared for war, news reached him from home. Nabopolassar's health was failing. The old founder of the empire lay dying in his palace, surrounded by priests and family. The transition of power was imminent. In Mesopotamia, such moments were perilous. Succession crises had destroyed dynasties before, and ambitious generals or governors could turn rebellion into ruin overnight. But Nebuchadnezzar's reputation shielded him. His victories, his loyalty, and his charisma had already won the hearts of both soldiers and citizens. Babylon awaited his return, not with fear, but with expectation. The people knew that a warrior king was rising, one who could secure their place among the stars of history. When word came that his father had died, Nebuchadnezzar acted swiftly. He concluded his western campaign, secured temporary peace with his enemies, and began the long journey back to Babylon. Chroniclers note that he left behind trusted generals to maintain order, a sign of his discipline and foresight even in moments of grief. He crossed the Euphrates with an army at his back and triumph in his heart. The gates of Babylon opened wide for him. The priests of Marduk conducted the coronation ceremony in the XIII temple, anointing him with sacred oils and crowning him with the royal diadem. Trumpets sounded, drums rolled, and from the ziggurat's height, incense rose toward the heavens. The city, reborn from ashes, now stood at the height of splendor, and at its helm was a man whose ambition stretched beyond the horizon, Nebuchadnezzar II. King of Babylon had ascended the throne. In the years to come, he would be called King of the Four Quarters, Lord of Lands, and Defender of the faith of Marduk. Yet for now, he was still a man of steel and resolve, standing at the beginning of a reign that would transform the face of the ancient world. The wars were far from over. The rebuilding of Babylon had only begun. The gods had placed immense power in his hands, and with it an unshakable sense of destiny. The Battle of Carchemish. The sun rose over the Euphrates, casting a red glow upon the dust of the plains. Before Nebuchadnezzar spread the vast encampment of his army, thousands of soldiers, chariots, and siege engines assembled for a battle that would decide the fate of empires. Beyond the river on the opposite bank stood the forces of Egypt under Pharaoh Necho II, allied with the remnants of the Assyrian army. The city of Carchemish, ancient and formidable, stood between them like a gate to the Western world. It was the year 605 BCE. The Assyrian Empire was already broken, its cities burned and its kings dead. Yet its last loyalists had fled westward, seeking refuge under Egypt's banner. Pharaoh Necho, eager to extend his influence, saw an opportunity to dominate the trade routes of the Near East. But Babylon, young, fierce, and ascending, would not yield those lands so easily. The two greatest armies of their age now faced one another across the waters. The Euphrates shimmered like molten bronze under the heat of midday. From the Babylonian camp the sound of drums echoed steady and deep. Standards bearing the lion of Marduk waved in the wind. Archers checked their bowstrings, charioteers oiled their wheels, and the king's personal guard, men clad in scaled armor, stood in perfect formation around the royal chariot. Nebuchadnezzar rode among his men, speaking little but watching everything. He was young, perhaps 30 years old, yet already seasoned by a dozen campaigns. His face bore the calm focus of one who understood that the fate of nations rested upon his next command. Marduk has chosen this day, he told his generals. The enemies of Babylon will fall, and the river will run red with the pride of Egypt. The battle began with a roar that shook the sky. Babylonian catapults launched stones toward the Egyptian positions. Archers released volleys that darkened the air. Egyptian chariots, fast and deadly, raced along the riverbank, loosing arrows into the advancing ranks. But Nebuchadnezzar's troops were disciplined, trained in the Assyrian art of formation warfare. They moved as one body, shields interlocked, pushing forward behind heavy infantry while flanking chariots swept in from the sides. The first clash came near the ford, where both armies met in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Spears broke, swords flashed, and the air filled with the cries of the dying. Egyptian archers from the far bank rained arrows across the water, but the Babylonians pressed forward relentlessly, driving them back with wave after wave of assault. Nebuchadnezzar's own chariot thundered through the chaos, his presence rallying his troops. The Egyptians fought bravely, but their lines began to falter. They had marched far from home, their supply routes stretched thin, their morale shaken by the memory of Assyria's collapse. The Babylonian war machine, on the other hand, was fresh and determined. Behind its strength lay the organization of a new empire, disciplined soldiers, engineers, and commanders who had mastered both siegecraft and open battle. For hours the battle raged. Dust clouds rose so thick that the sun disappeared. The Euphrates ran dark with mud and blood. The city of Carchemish, once proud and ancient, trembled as its gates were struck by battering rams. Babylonian siege towers rolled forward, their tops bristling with archers. The defenders fought from the walls, pouring boiling pitch and stones onto the attackers below. But the Babylonians had brought with them the knowledge of 100 years of Assyrian warfare. They knew how to break walls, how to tunnel beneath gates, how to wait out exhaustion. At the height of the battle, Nebuchadnezzar ordered his chariots to circle and strike from the flank. The move caught the Egyptians off guard. Their formations broke, their chariots tangled in retreat. What began as resistance turned into rout. Egyptian soldiers fled toward the river only to find their bridges burned behind them. The survivors threw down their weapons and plunged into the water, many drowning in the attempt to escape. By evening, the field belonged to Babylon. Smoke rose over Carchemish, its gates shattered, its defenders slain or captured. The Egyptian banners lay trampled in the mud. Nebuchadnezzar rode through the ruins silent amid the victory chants. His men cheered him as conqueror of Carchemish, breaker of Pharaoh, and defender of the gods. The young general had just secured the most decisive victory of his generation. The consequences were immense. With Egypt defeated, Babylon now controlled all of Syria and Palestine. The trade routes from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf fell under its command. No rival remained in the Near East strong enough to challenge its dominance. Nebuchadnezzar's name spread like wildfire through every city and caravan station. Merchants toasted him in taverns, priests praised him in temples, and foreign kings sent envoys bearing gifts of gold and tribute. Yet amid the triumph a shadow loomed. Only days after his victory, news arrived from Babylon. Nabopolassar, his father, was dead. The founder of the Neo-Babylonian Empire had passed away while his son was still on campaign. Nebuchadnezzar, now the heir to an empire, faced a difficult choice: continue his conquests or return home to secure the throne. He chose swiftly, as all great leaders must. Leaving his generals to oversee the occupation of the conquered territories, Nebuchadnezzar turned his army back toward Babylon. His march was swift and disciplined. The roads were lined with cheering citizens. They already knew of his victory at Carchemish. By the time he reached the great gates of the city, his legend had grown larger than life. Babylon itself seemed to celebrate his return. Trumpets sounded from the walls, priests chanted in the temples, and the river was lit with floating lamps. The coronation was both political and sacred, a ritual of continuity that tied Nebuchadnezzar's rule to the divine will of Marduk. He entered the temple of XIII, bowed before the golden statue of the god, and received the royal scepter from the high priest. The oath of kingship was simple but weighty: to uphold justice, to defend the people, and to honor the gods through strength. Nebuchadnezzar accepted it without hesitation. His mind was already on the future, the reconstruction of Babylon, the expansion of empire, and the establishment of a legacy that would outlast every city and kingdom around him. The victory at Carchemish was more than a military triumph. It marked the birth of a new world order. Egypt's power was broken, Assyria was gone, Babylon stood unrivaled, and its new king was not content with mere dominance. He sought greatness. From this moment forward, Nebuchadnezzar would no longer be known merely as a prince or a general. He would be remembered as the King of Kings, the architect of the golden age of Babylon. But as history often reminds us, the glory of empire is only the beginning of its story. Ahead lay the grand works, the towering walls, the conquests and the captivities, and the heavy burden of a ruler who believed that he ruled by divine right. The Lion of Babylon had tasted victory. Now he would build an empire worthy of his name, the crowning of a conqueror. The Euphrates shimmered beneath the summer sun as Nebuchadnezzar entered the city of Babylon, not as a prince, not as a general, but as king. Behind him marched an army still bearing the dust of Carchemish, their armor dulled by victory and exhaustion. Trumpets echoed from the city's towers, announcing to all of Mesopotamia that the son of Nabopolassar had returned to claim his father's throne. The streets were alive with celebration. Merchants threw flowers from their stalls, priests lifted incense before the gates, and women ululated from rooftops as the royal procession made its way toward the great temple of XIII. It was here, before the towering ziggurat Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, that Babylon's new ruler would receive the symbols of his authority. The coronation ceremony of a Babylonian king was no simple matter of politics. It was a covenant with the gods. The high priest of Marduk, wearing robes embroidered with gold thread, awaited Nebuchadnezzar at the temple entrance. The ceremony began at dawn, when the rising sun lit the temple steps with a glow that seemed almost divine. The king-to-be knelt before the statue of Marduk, the city's protector, and offered his prayer. "O Lord of Lords, grant me wisdom to rule your people. Make my reign a beacon of justice. Let Babylon's walls rise strong beneath your gaze." The priest anointed his forehead with oil, placed the crown upon his head, and handed him the scepter carved from cedar and overlaid with silver. The moment marked the formal transfer of divine authority. Nebuchadnezzar rose no longer merely the heir of Nabopolassar, but the chosen of Marduk, the earthly guardian of Babylon's destiny. The people rejoiced. The coronation was followed by days of festival. Oxen were sacrificed, musicians played harps and drums, and dancers performed in the courtyards of the palace. Even the canals were decorated with garlands and floating lamps. Babylon, reborn from centuries of turmoil, now stood at the height of promise. But amid the revelry, Nebuchadnezzar's mind was already turning toward the burdens of rule. His father had founded the empire through war. It fell to him to preserve it through order, strength, and magnificence. He understood that empire could not rest on conquest alone. It needed walls, institutions, and symbols that would endure. His first acts as king reflected this understanding. He reorganized the army, establishing a permanent corps of engineers, archers, and charioteers drawn from across the empire. He ensured that the canals were dredged and repaired, for he knew that control of water was the lifeblood of Mesopotamia. He summoned scribes to codify laws and commanded that records of his reign be kept on clay tablets for posterity. The king also sent envoys to the Medes, securing the alliance that his father had forged through diplomacy and marriage. His own queen, Amytis, was of Median royalty, a union meant to bind the two powers through blood. Though the details of their marriage remain shrouded in history, the bond between them would inspire one of the most famous legends of antiquity. At the heart of Nebuchadnezzar's rule lay a vision of renewal. He saw Babylon not merely as a capital, but as a reflection of the heavens themselves, a sacred mirror of divine order on earth. To him, rebuilding Babylon was not vanity but duty. The old city, though vast, was worn by centuries of invasion and neglect. Walls had crumbled, temples had fallen into disrepair, and the processional way leading to the temple of Marduk was little more than a dusty track. Nebuchadnezzar would change all of this. He began with the walls. They were to be so wide that a four-horse chariot could race along the top. The bricks were fired and glazed in bright colors, blues, ochres, and golds, each marked with his royal inscription, "I am Nebuchadnezzar, King of Babylon, protector of the people, servant of Marduk." Next came the Ishtar Gate, the grand entrance to the city, adorned with images of dragons, bulls, and lions in shimmering relief. Each creature symbolized a god, Marduk, Adad, and Ishtar, patrons of power, storm, and love. The gate was more than a passageway. It was a declaration of divine favor, a testament that Babylon stood under the protection of heaven. To strengthen his empire's unity, Nebuchadnezzar made Babylon the center of all religious and political life. Governors from distant provinces were required to attend festivals and bring tribute. Priests from conquered cities were invited to offer prayers in Babylon's temples, reinforcing the idea that all gods served under Marduk's supremacy. In this way, Nebuchadnezzar built not only walls of brick, but walls of belief, bonds of loyalty sealed through ritual and grandeur. His ambitions, however, extended beyond architecture. Nebuchadnezzar was a military king at heart. Even as masons laid bricks in Babylon, his generals patrolled the frontiers. Rebellions in Syria and Palestine still flared, and Egypt had not forgotten its humiliation at Carchemish. The king maintained constant vigilance, sending armies to secure his borders and to remind the world that Babylon's rule was absolute. The chronicles speak of his presence in council, tall, commanding, with eyes that missed nothing. He was both meticulous and relentless. A general once described him as a man who could build a palace by day and plan a siege by night. To his allies he was just and wise, to his enemies merciless and inevitable. Despite his stern rule, Nebuchadnezzar's court was a place of learning and artistry. Scholars studied astronomy and mathematics, priests refined the calendar, and architects experimented with new designs. The king valued knowledge as a form of power. He encouraged the recording of omens, the observation of stars, and the compilation of laws. Under his reign, Babylon became not only the military heart of the world, but also its intellectual center. As the years passed, the city transformed. Its gates gleamed with blue glazed brick. Its streets were lined with temples and statues. The Euphrates was channeled through canals that glittered under the torchlight at night. Visitors from distant lands, from the Nile to the Indus, marveled at its splendor. In the quiet of the palace gardens, Nebuchadnezzar often reflected on the burden he carried. To rule Babylon was to hold a mirror to eternity. Every stone laid, every law decreed, every battle fought would echo through history. He believed himself chosen for this, not by chance, but by the will of the gods. And yet, even as his power grew, so too did his sense of destiny's weight. For he knew that conquest had given him his throne, but only wisdom could preserve it. The Lion of Babylon was now crowned, and his roar would soon shake the world. The walls of Babylon. The sun rose over Babylon, glinting off towers and temples that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The city hummed with energy, merchants calling in the market's builders, hammering at scaffolds, oxen, pulling carts laden with fresh-cut stone. Babylon was becoming something more than a city. It was becoming a vision of eternity. And at the heart of that vision stood its ruler, Nebuchadnezzar II, determined to make it the most magnificent place the ancient world had ever known. Babylon sat on both sides of the Euphrates River, surrounded by fertile plains fed by canals and irrigation ditches that branched out like veins from the city's heart. The king knew that to secure his empire he must first secure its center. Invaders had come and gone, the Elamites, the Assyrians, even the Hittites, in ages past, each leaving their mark upon its soil. But Nebuchadnezzar would ensure that none could ever breach its heart again. He would raise walls that no army could conquer, that no time could wear down. He began with plans drawn in careful detail by the empire's best architects and engineers. The outer fortifications would encircle the city like a ring of bronze. 2 parallel walls of baked brick and bitumen, the thick, tar-like substance used for waterproofing, would rise to dizzying heights. The space between them, wide enough for chariots to ride, would serve both as a road and as a defensive corridor. Chroniclers claimed that 24 chariots could ride abreast atop the main wall, a boast that might have been exaggerated but carried the weight of awe all the same. The work was immense. Thousands of laborers toiled day and night, hauling bricks fired in kilns that glowed red against the twilight sky. Each brick bore the royal stamp, the inscription of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, chosen of Marduk, the protector of his people. Clay tablets record his words from this time, "I built a strong wall that none shall breach. Its foundations I laid deep as the waters. Its top I raised higher than the mountains. May it stand forever as the glory of Babylon." The city's walls became its pride, visible from miles away. Travelers arriving across the desert would first see the shimmer of glazed blue brick, then the towering gates that guarded the entrances to the inner sanctum of Babylon. Of these, none was more famous than the Ishtar Gate dedicated to the goddess of war, love, and renewal. The Ishtar Gate was no mere fortification. It was a masterpiece of art and devotion. Its surface gleamed with glazed bricks of deep cobalt blue, representing the heavens. Across this celestial background marched rows of golden lions, bulls, and dragons, the sacred beasts of Ishtar, Adad, and Marduk. Each figure was molded and fired with precision, their bodies catching the sunlight as if alive. Through the massive arch of the gate ran the processional way, a grand avenue that stretched more than half a mile through the city, paved with limestone and decorated with the same shimmering beasts. During religious festivals, priests, nobles, and citizens would march along this path, carrying statues of the gods toward the temple of Marduk in solemn procession. Nebuchadnezzar spared no expense in making Babylon both beautiful and impregnable. Behind the Ishtar Gate stood inner walls and fortified towers that reached 30 meters high. Canals and moats diverted from the Euphrates added a natural line of defense, creating layers of barriers between the city and any potential invader. From the towers one could look out across the plains and see the world itself, stretching away the lands of Akkad, the distant hills of Assyria, and the fading line of the western desert. But the city was not merely built for war, it was built for awe. Within its walls, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the restoration of the Etemenanki ziggurat, the colossal temple tower believed to have inspired later legends of the Tower of Babel. Its 7 terraces rose high above the city, each painted in a different color to represent the heavens. The topmost shrine, covered in gold, was said to shine so brightly that it reflected sunlight across the Euphrates like a second dawn. Here priests observed the stars and offered sacrifices to Marduk, believing that their rituals kept the cosmic balance in harmony with human affairs. In Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, religion and architecture were inseparable. Every temple, every gate, every street followed a symbolic order meant to reflect the structure of the universe. The king saw himself as the earthly counterpart to Marduk, the divine ruler of heaven. When he built for eternity, to leave behind a legacy that no conqueror could erase. To his people, he was more than a man. He was the chosen steward of divine perfection. And yet, behind the grandeur of walls and temples, Nebuchadnezzar's empire relied upon the toil of thousands of artisans, soldiers, and slaves brought from the conquered lands. Among them were captives from Judah, Syria, and Phoenicia. Some labored on his great projects, others served in his court. Babylon's splendor was a monument to power, but also a reminder of the cost of empire. Still, for those who lived within its walls, life flourished. Trade thrived along the river markets, brimmed with spices, textiles, and gold, and scholars studied the movement of the stars from observatories atop the ziggurats. Babylon was not only the most fortified city on earth, it was the most advanced. The city's irrigation system turned arid soil into gardens. Its canals carried grain and goods across hundreds of miles. Public works expanded in all directions. Roads to Borsippa and Sippar, bridges over the Euphrates, and storehouses filled with grain for times of famine. Nebuchadnezzar's rule was orderly, methodical, and relentless. He saw chaos as the enemy of civilization, and his walls were not merely stone, but a philosophy that through discipline and design, mankind could rise above the disorder of the world. The people believed in him. To them he was not just a conqueror, but a builder-king, one who restored the glory of the past while ensuring the safety of the future. Priests praised him in hymns, scribes chronicled his reign on tablets of clay, and artisans immortalized his likeness in carved reliefs. He had turned Babylon into a mirror of divine creation, a city so radiant that it seemed to stand outside of time itself. And yet, as his walls rose higher and his city gleamed brighter, so too did the weight of pride begin to settle upon him. For Nebuchadnezzar believed he had achieved what no man before him had done. He had rebuilt heaven upon the earth. The walls of Babylon stood strong, but beyond them storms of conquest were gathering again. Egypt had not forgotten its defeat. The lands of Judah and Syria still chafed under foreign rule. To preserve what he had built, Nebuchadnezzar would soon have to return to war. The Hanging Gardens. From the heart of Babylon rose one of the greatest wonders ever to grace the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens. To stand before them was to question what was possible for mortal hands to build. Terraces of green and gold climbed toward the sky trees, swaying above the city's rooftops, waterfalls tumbling from one level to the next. Amid the heat of Mesopotamia, where desert winds carried dust and sun baked the plains, these gardens seemed a miracle of life, a mountain of color in a land of clay and stone. The story of their creation begins with love. Nebuchadnezzar's queen, Amytis of Media, had come from the north, from a land of rolling hills and cool mountain air. In Babylon, she found a city of brilliance and wealth, but missed the green slopes of her homeland. The endless horizon of the plain, though magnificent, left her longing for the forests and streams of Media. When the king saw her sorrow, he vowed to bring her mountains to Babylon. He summoned architects, engineers, and artisans from every corner of his empire. Under his command, they began designing something the world had never seen, an artificial mountain made of brick and stone, its layers rising like steps toward the heavens. It would be lush with plants from across the lands, date palms from Arabia, cedars from Lebanon, figs and pomegranates from Syria, and fragrant herbs from the Zagros Mountains. The project would stand not only as a gift to his queen, but as a symbol of his empire's reach, that all the world's beauty could be gathered in Babylon. The work began on the eastern bank of the Euphrates near the royal palace. First, they laid vast foundations of stone, something rare in Mesopotamia, where stone was precious and had to be brought from distant lands. Upon this base, they built a series of vaulted terraces, each supported by massive columns and arches. The design was an engineering marvel, a series of platforms layered one atop another, gradually ascending like a pyramid of gardens. Each terrace was waterproofed with layers of bitumen and lead to prevent moisture from seeping through the bricks. On top of this, thick soil was laid deep enough to support large trees and shrubs. Channels and aqueducts brought water from the Euphrates to the highest levels, a feat accomplished by ingenious mechanisms that historians later described as some of the first known systems of hydraulic irrigation. Ancient accounts tell of a device known as a chain pump, a series of rotating buckets or screws that lifted water upward, flowing continuously through the terraces. Day and night the sound of water could be heard trickling through the columns and pouring down the stone channels like a steady heartbeat. The air, cool and fragrant with jasmine and myrrh, provided refuge from the desert's heat. Amytis found peace among these hanging gardens. From her shaded walkways she could gaze out across the vast city her husband had built, the palaces, the temples, the ziggurat shining in the distance. The gardens became her sanctuary, and his triumph a fusion of nature and architecture that reflected the king's devotion and the empire's mastery of craft. To those who came from afar, the sight was unbelievable. Greek travelers, centuries later, would write of the gardens as one of the 7 wonders of the world. They spoke of terraces rising 75 feet high, of trees rooted in stone, and of a mountain suspended in the air. Some doubted their existence altogether, thinking them myth, but Babylonian records and archaeological traces tell us that the idea, whether fact, legend, or both, was born under Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The hanging gardens served more than a personal purpose. They represented Babylon's transformation from a city of conquest to a city of civilization. For Nebuchadnezzar, beauty was power, a reflection of divine order. To create a paradise in the midst of the desert was to show that the gods favored Babylon above all cities. In the inscriptions found later in his palaces, the king wrote, "I raised high the terraces to rival the mountains. I planted orchards and trees in abundance. I made the dry land bloom and brought delight to the eyes of my queen." These words capture both his pride and his purpose. To the Babylonians, the gardens were not merely a gift of love, they were a living symbol of divine harmony, proof that the king ruled in accord with the gods. Within their shade, court poets recited hymns to Ishtar, goddess of fertility and renewal. Scholars and philosophers walked the terraces discussing the stars, the earth, and the order of creation. Diplomats and traders arriving from far-off lands were led first to the gardens, for Nebuchadnezzar understood that a ruler's strength was measured not only by the size of his armies, but by the marvel of his city. The gardens became the crown jewel of Babylon, visible from miles away. Travelers on the western desert roads would see them long before they reached the city's gates, green terraces shimmering against the golden dust. To see Babylon, then, with its walls, temples, and gardens, was to witness the center of the world. But as Babylon's grandeur grew, so too did Nebuchadnezzar's sense of destiny. He had conquered the enemies of his father, rebuilt the city of the gods, and made the desert bloom. To him there seemed no limit to what divine favor could achieve. Yet such conviction carried with it a dangerous weight, the pride of believing oneself indispensable to the order of heaven. Still, for now, the king's reign shone bright. The gardens stood as a triumph of love and power, a bridge between earth and paradise. And as night fell over Babylon, the sound of water cascading through the terraces mingled with the music of flutes and the hum of life in the streets below. For Amytis they were a memory of home. For Nebuchadnezzar they were a monument to eternity. And for the world beyond Babylon's walls they became a legend that would never fade. The faith of Babylon. The city of Babylon did not merely rise upon the foundations of brick and stone. It stood upon faith. Every tower, every street, every gate was shaped by devotion to the gods who ruled the heavens and the earth. To understand Nebuchadnezzar's empire, one must first understand the religion that flowed through its heart, as vital as the Euphrates itself. To the Babylonians, life was governed by the divine. The world was not a random expanse of nature, but a carefully balanced order sustained by the will of the gods. The heavens were a kingdom reflecting their own, and the king of Babylon was not simply a ruler, he was the earthly representative of that cosmic hierarchy. Nebuchadnezzar believed this with absolute conviction. His authority, his victories, and his city's greatness were in his mind direct evidence that Marduk, chief of the gods, favored him above all men. At the center of Babylon's spiritual life stood the XIII temple complex, a sprawling sanctuary dedicated to Marduk, the city's patron deity. The temple was more than a place of worship, it was the heart of the empire's identity. Its priests guarded the rituals that kept the universe in balance, interpreting omens, tracking the movements of the stars, and performing sacrifices that ensured prosperity. Nebuchadnezzar saw to its restoration, personally ordering the rebuilding of its courtyards, its shrines, and the colossal ziggurat known as Etemenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth. This ziggurat, rising in 7 terraces toward the sky, symbolized the link between the divine and mortal realms. Each level represented a celestial sphere painted in colors that reflected the heavens: black for Saturn, red for Mars, white for Jupiter, and blue for Venus. At its summit, a shrine housed a golden bed and table where, according to tradition, Marduk could rest during his visits to Earth. The king himself was not permitted to enter except during sacred festivals, when he would symbolically renew his covenant with the gods. The most important of these festivals was the Akitu, the New Year celebration, held each spring. For 12 days the city became a theater of devotion. Statues of the gods from across Mesopotamia were brought to Babylon, paraded through the streets, and placed in the XIII temple. The people sang hymns and offered gifts, while the priests recited the Enuma Elish, the great creation epic of Babylon. This story told how Marduk, the warrior god, defeated the chaos dragon Tiamat and shaped the world from her remains, establishing order from disorder, light from darkness. For Nebuchadnezzar, the symbolism was profound. Just as Marduk had conquered chaos, so had he conquered the enemies of Babylon. Just as Marduk ruled over the gods, so did he rule over men. The rituals of Akitu reaffirmed his role as the chosen instrument of divine will. On the 4th day of the festival, the king would enter the temple alone and kneel before the golden statue of Marduk. The high priest would remove his crown scepter and sword, leaving him bare before the god. The priest then struck him across the face, not in insult, but as a sacred test. If tears came to the king's eyes, it meant that Marduk had accepted his humility and would bless his reign for another year. If he did not weep, it was a bad omen, a sign that the god's favor might be fading. Such ceremonies reminded even the most powerful king that his authority was conditional, dependent upon divine grace. Yet for Nebuchadnezzar, these rituals also reinforced his confidence. Year after year the tears came, and the priest proclaimed that Marduk was pleased. Religion under Nebuchadnezzar extended far beyond Babylon's walls. Throughout the empire, he rebuilt temples to ancient gods in cities like Borsippa, and Lhasa. He restored sanctuaries neglected during the years of Assyrian dominance, presenting himself as a restorer of faith, not a conqueror. This policy strengthened his rule. The conquered peoples, though under Babylonian authority, saw in Nebuchadnezzar a ruler who respected their gods and traditions. By honoring their temples, he bound their loyalty through reverence rather than fear. Priests and astronomers held great influence at his court. Babylonian religion was inseparable from science. To study the stars was to read the thoughts of the gods. Each night, temple astronomers charted the movements of planets and constellations, recording them on clay tablets. Their observations formed the foundation of astronomy for centuries to come. They believed the heavens reflected the fate of kingdoms, that eclipses warned of danger, and that the rising of certain stars foretold victory. Nebuchadnezzar listened carefully to their counsel. Before every campaign, before every great building project, he sought the omens. In the royal inscriptions that survive from his reign, Nebuchadnezzar often invoked the gods not just as divine patrons, but as collaborators in his works. He wrote of Marduk guiding his hands in battle of Ishtar, strengthening his armies of Nabu, the god of wisdom inspiring his architects. To him the empire was a divine partnership. The gods ruled the heavens, and he ruled the earth in their name. But such faith, while absolute, carried with it a seed of peril. When a ruler sees his success as proof of divine sanction, pride can grow unchecked. Nebuchadnezzar's confidence in Marduk's favor deepened into an unshakable belief that he himself was part of the divine plan, that his will and the will of the gods were one. Still in these years Babylon flourished under his devotion. The temples gleamed with gold, the priests sang hymns to the gods of creation, and pilgrims came from across the empire to offer prayers in the shadow of the great ziggurat. The city's skyline shimmered with sacred splendor, and its streets echoed with the sound of festivals, music, and prayer. It was a time of faith and of glory, a golden age when heaven and earth seemed to meet within the walls of Babylon. But beyond the horizon, the balance of divine favor would soon be tested. Nebuchadnezzar's armies would once again march westward toward the lands of Judah and Jerusalem, where his faith and the faith of others would collide in fire and prophecy. The conquest of Judah. The western lands had long been restless under Babylonian rule. After the victory at Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar's empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, a vast domain of deserts, mountains, and ancient cities. But with such distance came rebellion. The small kingdoms of Syria and Palestine, once loyal to Assyria or Egypt, now shifted uneasily beneath the weight of Babylon's power. Among them, none would test Nebuchadnezzar's resolve more than the kingdom of Judah. Judah was small compared to the great empires of the age, but it held a spirit that refused submission. Its capital, Jerusalem, perched high upon a ridge of limestone hills, was both fortress and sanctuary, home to the great Temple of Solomon, the center of Hebrew faith. For generations its people had believed themselves protected by their covenant with one God Yahweh and by the sanctity of their city. Yet that faith would soon collide with the relentless will of Babylon's king. The first encounter came in 605 BCE, not long after Nebuchadnezzar's coronation. Following his triumph over Egypt, the new king sought to secure his western provinces. Judah's young ruler Jehoiakim had sworn loyalty to Babylon, sending tribute as was customary. But alliances in this region were fragile, and Egypt, though defeated, still whispered promises of protection and revolt. Jehoiakim wavered a mistake that Nebuchadnezzar would not forgive. When word reached Babylon that Judah had withheld its tribute and was again courting Egypt, Nebuchadnezzar marched westward. His armies moved with the precision of a well-trained machine, chariots in front, infantry behind, siege engineers following with towers and rams. City after city fell along the route. The roads to Jerusalem filled with the dust of Babylonian columns. When the king's army appeared on the horizon, the people of Judah watched from their walls with dread. Jehoiakim died during the siege, and his son Jehoiachin inherited a throne already surrounded. The young king, realizing the hopelessness of resistance, surrendered after only 3 months. In 597 BCE, Babylon's banners entered Jerusalem. The gates opened, and the city fell without destruction for now. Nebuchadnezzar spared it from fire, choosing instead to humble it completely. The treasures of Solomon's temple, golden vessels, sacred ornaments, and the ark's coverings were taken as tribute to Babylon. The king himself, along with his court craftsmen and thousands of citizens, was led away in chains. It was the beginning of what history calls the Babylonian exile, a forced migration that would change the destiny of an entire people. The captives were taken eastward across the deserts and rivers into the heart of the empire. There they would live among Babylon's canals and temples, their faith tested but never extinguished. Nebuchadnezzar placed Zedekiah, Jehoiachin's uncle, upon the throne of Judah, a vassal king meant to govern in Babylon's name. But peace in that land was fragile, and Babylonian governors soon reported new unrest. Zedekiah, encouraged by prophets and Egyptian envoys, began to dream of independence. Once more Judah prepared to rise. For Nebuchadnezzar, rebellion was not merely a political matter, it was an affront to divine order. To defy Babylon was to defy Marduk himself. When Zedekiah broke his oath and withheld tribute, the response was swift and terrible. In 589 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar launched his second and final campaign against Judah. His armies surrounded Jerusalem and began a siege that would last nearly 2 years. The Babylonian army was unmatched in siege warfare. Engineers built ramps of earth and stone towering siege engines, and battering rams reinforced with bronze. Archers rained arrows upon the walls day and night. The city's defenders, brave but desperate, resisted as famine and disease took hold. Chronicles later written in both Babylonian and Hebrew texts describe the same grim scene, starvation so severe that people searched refuse heaps for food. The sound of mourning filled the city as the walls began to crack under the relentless pounding of Babylon's machines. In 587 or 586 BCE, the defenses finally collapsed. Babylonian soldiers poured into Jerusalem. The Temple of Solomon, the pride of Israel, the dwelling place of its God, was set ablaze. Flames consumed its cedar beams and gold-covered walls. Smoke rose over the hills, visible for miles. The palace and houses were looted, the city walls torn down. Zedekiah tried to flee under cover of darkness, but was captured near Jericho. Nebuchadnezzar ordered him brought before his generals. His sons were executed before his eyes, and then he was blinded, a brutal act of punishment reserved for oath breakers. He was taken in chains to Babylon, where he would live out his days in captivity. Jerusalem lay in ruins. Its people, broken and scattered, were carried away into exile. Some remained in the land under Babylonian governors, but the heart of the kingdom was gone. The chroniclers of Judah wrote of their sorrow beside the rivers of Babylon, where they sat and wept, remembering Zion. Yet even in their grief they found meaning. The prophets spoke that their suffering was not the end, but a purification, that Yahweh himself had allowed Babylon's triumph as judgment for their disobedience. Nebuchadnezzar unknowingly had become an instrument in another faith's divine plan. For the Babylonians, the conquest was complete and just. In their chronicles, Nebuchadnezzar was described as the restorer of order, the servant of Marduk who smote the rebels. To his people he was a hero who brought peace to a rebellious frontier. But to the exiles he was the destroyer of the holy city, a name to be remembered with both awe and sorrow for generations. The king returned to Babylon bearing spoils beyond measure, gold from the temple captives, skilled in metalwork and stone, and sacred vessels that would adorn the treasuries of Esagila. The triumphal procession entered the city through the Ishtar Gate, where priests chanted blessings to Marduk for victory. The temples rang with music, sacrifices were made, and Babylon rejoiced. Yet among the captives were not only laborers but scholars and prophets' men who would carry the memory of Jerusalem into foreign lands. In their writings, Nebuchadnezzar's name would echo through centuries, both as conqueror and as a figure through whom divine purpose was revealed. In this, the king's legacy crossed the borders of empires and entered the realm of Scripture. The conquest of Judah was more than the destruction of a kingdom. It was the meeting of two worlds, Babylonian grandeur and Hebrew faith. In the ashes of Jerusalem, a new chapter of history began, one written in both lamentation and endurance. Nebuchadnezzar had fulfilled his duty as the guardian of empire. His armies had brought peace to the west, his gods had been honored, and his city had grown richer still. But his victories, however complete, would not bring him rest. For within the conquered lands of Judah, stories began to spread, stories of prophets of dreams and of a God who spoke not through temples of stone, but through visions that reached even the heart of Babylon itself, the captives and the dreamers. The road from Jerusalem to Babylon was long, stretching across deserts and rivers, a journey of sorrow that marked the beginning of exile for thousands of Judean captives. Among them were priests, craftsmen, scholars and prophets, all torn from their homeland and bound for the heart of Nebuchadnezzar's empire. The once proud people of Judah now marched beneath the banners of Babylon, their songs turned to lamentations, their faith tested beneath foreign skies. When the exiles finally arrived, they beheld a sight unlike anything they had ever known. Babylon was vast beyond imagination, its walls towering, its gates adorned with beasts of gold, and lapis lazuli, its ziggurat rising like a mountain into the heavens. Canals cut through the city like rivers of glass, carrying boats heavy with grain, wine, and incense. The air was alive with the hum of markets and the scent of oil lamps burning before the shrines of strange gods. For the Judeans, the beauty of the city was both awe-inspiring and painful, a reminder of their defeat and of the world's shifting order. Nebuchadnezzar welcomed them not as mere slaves, but as subjects of the empire. Many were resettled along the banks of the canals that fed the city's lifeblood, set to work as builders, farmers, and artisans. Others skilled in trade or writing were integrated into Babylonian administration. In this way, the captives became part of the vast mechanism that sustained the empire, a living testament to its reach and diversity. Yet among them were men whose minds were not conquered prophets, who carried their faith like a fire hidden beneath ashes. They spoke of their God Yahweh, who had allowed their fall not out of weakness, but as discipline, and who would one day restore them. In their exile they began to redefine faith no longer tied to temple or land, but to memory, law, and hope. The destruction of Jerusalem had stripped away their certainties, but it had also given birth to endurance. It was in this period that stories began to circulate, stories that would outlast kingdoms and carry the name of Nebuchadnezzar into every age that followed. Among the most enduring were those of a young Judean named Daniel, and his companions' men said to have been taken from Jerusalem's noble families to serve in the Babylonian court. The tale preserved in later writings describes how Nebuchadnezzar ordered that the brightest of the captives be educated in the language and learning of the Chaldeans. They were to serve as advisors, scholars, and interpreters of dreams. Daniel, known for his wisdom and devotion, quickly distinguished himself. When the king was troubled by dreams that none of his wise men could explain, it was Daniel who offered the interpretation not through the arts of divination, but through revelation from his God. The dream as told was strange and powerful. Nebuchadnezzar saw a colossal statue, its head of gold, chest of silver belly, of bronze legs of iron and feet of clay. A stone cut without hands struck the statue and shattered it, leaving only dust. Daniel explained that the statue represented a succession of kingdoms, Babylon the head of gold, followed by others that would rise and fall. The stone, he said, symbolized a divine kingdom that would endure forever. Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He fell before Daniel, acknowledging the God who revealed secrets hidden from men. Surely, he declared, your God is the God of gods and Lord of kings. From that day, Daniel and his companions were honored in the court, though their faith set them apart in a land of many idols. To the Judeans, this story carried deep meaning. It told of survival, not through rebellion or arms, but through wisdom, faith, and the quiet defiance of conscience. It showed that even in exile their God still spoke even through the dreams of a foreign king. Nebuchadnezzar himself, though a man of iron will, was deeply moved by visions and omens. He was a conqueror, but also a dreamer, a king who saw in his sleep the same mysteries that priests sought in the stars. The Babylonians believed that dreams were messages from the gods, and that the fate of kingdoms could be revealed in the night. To Nebuchadnezzar, his dreams were both comfort and torment. They reminded him of the divine partnership he believed guided his reign, but they also revealed the fragility of earthly power. The Judean exiles, meanwhile, settled into their new lives. Over time, they built communities along the canals, adapting to Babylonian customs while preserving their own. They met on holy days, told stories of their ancestors, and sang psalms beside the waters. By the rivers of Babylon, they would later write, "We sat and wept when we remembered Zion." Their longing for Jerusalem became the foundation of a faith that could survive without walls or temple, a faith that lived in memory and in word. For Nebuchadnezzar, their presence was a mark of success. To him, Babylon's greatness lay not only in conquest, but in unity, in the gathering of nations beneath the rule of Marduk. The Judeans were now part of that divine order, serving a higher purpose even if they did not see it so. Yet the king's satisfaction was shadowed by unease. The prophets among the exiles spoke of a single God, greater than all others, a God who humbled kings and raised nations according to his will. To Nebuchadnezzar's priests, this was arrogance. To the king, it was a mystery that lingered in his thoughts. In the years that followed, the relationship between Nebuchadnezzar and the Judeans became more than that of conqueror and conquered. It became a dialogue between two worlds, one built on temples and idols, the other on an unseen faith. Babylon gave the exiles a new home. The exiles gave Babylon a mirror in which to see its own power reflected and questioned. As the captives adapted to their new lives, Babylon reached its cultural zenith. Scholars translated ancient texts, astronomers recorded eclipses, and artisans filled the city with art. In this meeting of civilizations, knowledge and belief intertwined. The Judeans absorbed the language and learning of their captors, while their own ideas of justice, covenant, and divine sovereignty quietly took root in Babylon's soil. It was a paradox of history. The empire that had destroyed their temple would in time help preserve their faith. Through exile, their traditions would become stronger, more enduring, more universal. And through their presence, Nebuchadnezzar's empire, already a wonder of architecture and might, would become a crossroads of spirit and thought. Yet, even as harmony seemed to settle over the city, Nebuchadnezzar's mind would soon be troubled again by dreams, visions that no priest could still and no god could explain to his satisfaction. The Lion of Babylon, at the height of his power, was beginning to sense the weight of something greater than all his conquests, the limits of his own understanding. Dreams of a troubled king. The empire stood at its height. Babylon's walls gleamed in the sun, its temples shone with gold, and its canals carried the lifeblood of a civilization that stretched farther than the eye could see. To the people, Nebuchadnezzar was a living legend, a king favored by the gods, the architect of prosperity and peace. Yet within the palace, amid marble columns and hanging tapestries, the great ruler's sleep began to falter. At first the dreams came quietly, fleeting images, strange shapes in the dark that left him uneasy upon waking. But soon they grew more vivid, more insistent. Each night the visions returned, filled with omens he could not decipher. He awoke drenched in sweat, his mind clouded with fear. His attendants described him pacing the palace floors before dawn, muttering about a statue of fire and shadow that crumbled before his eyes. To a Babylonian king, dreams were no trivial matter. They were the voice of the divine, the secret language through which the gods revealed their will. The empire's priests, the Baru, were masters of interpretation. They read omens in the stars, in the smoke of sacrifices, in the flight of birds. When Nebuchadnezzar summoned them, they gathered in the great hall beneath the murals of Marduk's victories. The air was thick with incense as the king, seated upon his throne of lapis and cedar, spoke of his troubling visions. "I have dreamed," he said, "and my spirit is troubled to know the dream." The priests bowed low, assuring him that they could interpret whatever the gods had revealed. But Nebuchadnezzar, suspicious of flattery and deceit, made a demand that startled them. He would not tell the dream itself. "If you are truly wise," he declared, "then tell me what I dreamed and what it means. If you cannot, you shall be cut in pieces and your houses made desolate." Panic rippled through the court. None could meet his challenge. The astrologers pleaded that no man could reveal what only the gods knew. The king's anger grew. He ordered the execution of all his wise men, the priests, the diviners, the magi. Among those marked for death were the Judean captives serving in his court, including Daniel the interpreter, whose insight had once calmed the king's fears. When word reached Daniel, he requested time to pray. That night, he and his companions sought mercy from their God, asking for wisdom to save their lives and to reveal the mystery troubling the king. In the quiet hours before dawn, the vision came to Daniel, the same dream that haunted Nebuchadnezzar. When morning arrived, he was brought before the throne. "O king," he said, "the secret which you have demanded cannot be revealed by wise men, astrologers, or diviners. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to you what shall come to pass." Then Daniel described the dream exactly as the king had seen it, a colossal statue standing upon the earth. Its head was made of gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet a mixture of iron and clay. Then a stone, cut not by human hands, struck the statue upon its feet, shattering it into dust. The wind carried the fragments away, but the stone grew into a great mountain that filled the whole earth. Nebuchadnezzar listened astonished as Daniel continued, "You, O king, are the head of gold. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and glory. But after you shall arise other kingdoms, inferior to yours, yet strong, and they shall divide the earth. In the end a kingdom not made by men shall rise and endure forever." For a long moment the great hall was silent. The king's breath trembled as he realized that Daniel had spoken the truth, not only describing his dream, but revealing its meaning. Then Nebuchadnezzar rose from his throne and bowed before the Judean captive. "Truly," he said, "your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and the revealer of secrets." He promoted Daniel to high rank among the wise men of Babylon, placing him in charge of the provinces. Yet even as gratitude filled him, the dream's message lingered in his mind. The prophecy that his kingdom, his magnificent empire, would one day fall, struck a chord of unease. He had built Babylon to last forever, its walls stronger than time itself. But the gods, it seemed, had decreed otherwise. As months passed, the dream continued to haunt him. He could not forget the image of the statue collapsing into dust. What if it was not merely a warning, but a challenge? Was he to accept that his power was temporary, or could he defy fate itself? The question burrowed deep within him, awakening a pride that even he could not control. In his determination to assert his glory, Nebuchadnezzar turned again to building. He expanded the processional way, rebuilt temples, and covered the city in inscriptions praising his reign. One carved into the walls of his palace read, "For the wonder of mankind I have built this city. May its name endure for all generations. None shall rival the work of Nebuchadnezzar, King of kings, Lord of the lands." To the Babylonians these words were triumph. To others they were a glimpse into the king's growing obsession with immortality. The more he tried to preserve his legacy, the more he seemed to fear its eventual end. In the palace gardens, Nebuchadnezzar often stood at the highest terrace looking out over the endless city. From there he could see the Euphrates winding like a ribbon of silver through the plains, the ziggurat piercing the sky, and the walls encircling Babylon like the arms of a god. The sight filled him with both pride and dread, pride in what he had created, and dread that it might one day vanish like the statue in his dream. The priest, seeking to ease his spirit, told him that Marduk's favor was eternal, that Babylon's destiny was secure. But Nebuchadnezzar's heart was restless. He began to see omens in everything, in the movements of stars, in the murmurs of wind, in the stillness of water at dawn. In the evenings when the palace grew quiet, he sometimes summoned Daniel to speak of his God, the God who revealed secrets and ruled over kings. Though Nebuchadnezzar did not abandon his faith in Marduk, he could not forget the power that had spoken through Daniel's words. Somewhere deep within him he began to sense that the divine order of the world was far greater than any single empire, greater even than Babylon itself. Still, the king could not surrender his pride. The dream of the crumbling statue became an obsession, a wound upon his spirit. He vowed to defy it, to build monuments so mighty that no prophecy could erase them. Yet history, like the heavens, moves in cycles. The higher he climbed, the greater the fall that awaited him. The dream that had begun as a whisper in the night would soon unfold in waking life, as the mighty king's pride met its reckoning, not through conquest, but through the silence of his own mind. The madness of the king. The years of glory passed, and Nebuchadnezzar's empire stood secure. Babylon gleamed brighter than ever before. Its temples were alive with song and sacrifice, its walls unbroken, its gardens eternal in their green splendor. The king's name was inscribed on every gate, every pillar, every brick. To his people, he was not merely a man, but a symbol, the chosen of Marduk, the embodiment of order. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, something had begun to change within him. Nebuchadnezzar had become restless. He had conquered nations, built wonders, and commanded the loyalty of millions, yet peace offered no satisfaction. Pride grew within him like a shadow that lengthened with the setting sun. The dream that Daniel had once interpreted, the statue that crumbled into dust, lingered in his memory. He had tried to silence it with temples and triumphs, but it remained whispering to him in the quiet hours of night. One evening he stood upon the roof of his palace. The air was cool, and the Euphrates shimmered beneath the moon. Below him stretched the vastness of his creation, a city of stone and light walls reaching to the horizon towers crowned with gold. The hanging gardens swayed gently in the breeze, the scent of cedar and myrrh drifting through the night. His court musicians played softly in the courtyards, their notes mingling with the sound of running water. It was a vision of perfection, a world crafted by his own hand. And then pride overcame humility. Looking out over the city, he spoke aloud. "Is this not the great Babylon that I have built by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" The words had barely left his lips when silence fell. The breeze stilled, the lamps flickered, and something heavy pressed upon his spirit. In that stillness he heard not with his ears, but with his soul, a voice that seemed to echo from beyond the stars. "O Nebuchadnezzar, the kingdom is departed from you. You shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, until you learn that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men." A sudden tremor shook his body. His attendants rushed to him, but his gaze was vacant. The proud king of Babylon, the lord of nations, collapsed upon the marble floor, his crown tumbling from his head. What followed was a transformation, so strange, so tragic, that it became legend. In the months that followed, Nebuchadnezzar withdrew from his throne. His mind, once sharp and commanding, fell into confusion. He wandered the palace gardens in silence, speaking to no one. The priests whispered that the king had lost Marduk's favor, that some divine judgment had fallen upon him. Others said that madness had consumed him, a punishment for pride. As his condition worsened, he abandoned the palace altogether. Guards reported seeing him in the outer fields beyond the city, his royal robes torn and his hair unkempt. He lived among the animals, eating grass and herbs, his body hardened by the sun and rain. For 7 years, or what felt like 7, he remained in this state, a man stripped of reason and dignity. The Lion of Babylon had become a beast of the earth. During this time, the empire endured under the careful governance of his officials. The people continued their festivals, the priests their sacrifices. But in the hearts of many, a quiet unease grew. How could the chosen of Marduk fall so low? Some whispered that the god of the Judeans, the one who had revealed dreams and foretold kingdoms, had humbled Babylon's king to prove his power. Out in the fields, Nebuchadnezzar's world had shrunk to the rhythm of the seasons. He watched the wind bend the grass, the rain darken the soil, the stars turn across the sky. In his solitude, the pride that had driven him for so long began to fade. He came to see the smallness of human might beside the vastness of creation. His mind, though clouded, began to grasp a truth that no monument could capture, that all power, even the power of kings, was a gift, not a possession. Then one morning, as the sun rose over the plains, something within him changed. The fog lifted. His thoughts, once broken, grew clear again. He looked toward Babylon in the distance, the walls gleaming, the towers shimmering in light, and fell to his knees. I, Nebuchadnezzar, he later wrote, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. When word reached the city that the king had returned to reason, the people rejoiced. The priests brought him back to the palace where he bathed, and was clothed once more in royal garments. His court greeted him with reverence and relief. Yet the man who stood before them was not the same ruler who had once proclaimed his glory from the palace roof. His pride was gone. In its place was a quiet strength, the wisdom of one who had been broken and restored. Nebuchadnezzar resumed his throne, but his rule was different now. He spoke more often of justice, of mercy, of the duty of kings to serve their people rather than dominate them. He continued to build and govern, but with newfound humility. His inscriptions no longer praised his own might, but gave thanks to the gods, and in one remarkable instance to the King of Heaven, whose power had brought him low and raised him again. To his subjects, this transformation was as awe-inspiring as any conquest. The tale spread through the empire. The king who lost his mind and lived as a beast had been restored by divine will. Some saw it as a warning against pride, others as proof of the gods' mercy. In time, the story would be remembered not only in Babylon's chronicles, but in the sacred writings of the Judeans, who saw in it the hand of their own god. In the twilight of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar often walked the gardens in silence. He no longer spoke of his greatness, but of the fragility of all human glory. The empire he had built stood firm, its walls unshaken, its streets alive with the pulse of life, but the man who once claimed it as his own now saw it differently. Babylon belonged not to him, nor even to Marduk, but to the vast and unknowable will that governed all things. The madness had passed, but its lesson endured. Even the mightiest king is but a servant before the eternal. The empire at its zenith. When Nebuchadnezzar returned to his throne, the empire he had built greeted him like a faithful servant awaiting its master. Babylon stood stronger than ever, its walls unbroken, its people prosperous, its gods honored in temples of marble and gold. Yet the man who ruled it now was not the same as before. The arrogance of the past had given way to reflection. The king who once sought to rival the heavens now governed with measured hands, his eyes turned toward the welfare of his people and the preservation of all he had made. The years that followed became known as the Golden Age of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Across its vast expanse from the Zagros Mountains in the east to the deserts of Egypt in the west, Babylonian order and wealth flourished. Trade routes pulsed, with caravans bearing spices from Arabia, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, and lapis from far Bactria. The Euphrates was crowded with boats, their sails white in the sunlight, as they carried goods to and from the capital. To the rest of the world, Babylon was the heart of civilization, a city so mighty and so radiant that poets called it the Gate of the Gods. Nebuchadnezzar's renewed reign was one of consolidation rather than conquest. He had already proven his might through war. Now he sought to immortalize his empire through peace and prosperity. His armies remained vigilant along the frontiers, but their swords were sheathed beneath the calm of stability. The roads were secure, the provinces orderly. The fields, nourished by the canals he had restored, yielded harvests beyond measure. Babylon had become a paradise of human achievement, an empire of learning, law, and labor, bound together by the vision of a ruler who had once known both triumph and humility. Within the city, his architectural projects continued, though their purpose had shifted. No longer were they monuments to his ego, but offerings to the gods and gifts to his people. He completed the restoration of the Etemenanki ziggurat, ensuring that it shone like a stairway to heaven. He ordered the enlargement of the XIII temple, adorning it with gold and lapis lazuli. The walls of Babylon were extended once more, their outer defenses expanded to encompass new districts filled with artisans, merchants, and scholars. The city itself had grown beyond its former limits, a metropolis teeming with life, perhaps the largest in the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar also turned his attention to education and governance. Under his reign, the scribal schools flourished. Libraries were filled with clay tablets preserving the wisdom of centuries, hymns, laws, astronomical charts, and epic tales. The study of mathematics, medicine, and astronomy reached new heights. Babylonian scholars charting the movements of planets and stars began to predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy. They believed that the heavens reflected the fate of kings, yet their observations laid the foundation for sciences that would endure long after Babylon's walls had turned to dust. In the royal court, music and learning thrived side by side. Harps and lyres played in the evenings, and poets recited verses praising the balance of divine and human order. The king listened more than he spoke. He was no longer the fierce general of his youth, nor the proud monarch of his middle years, but a statesman whose wisdom was born from both victory and humility. Foreign envoys came from distant lands, from Lydia, Phoenicia, and Egypt to pay tribute and to marvel at the harmony of his empire. Yet Nebuchadnezzar did not forget the cost of greatness. He remembered the years of madness and the loneliness of power. In his proclamations, he now emphasized justice and mercy. One inscription reads, "E Nebuchadnezzar, who once ruled by might, now rule by wisdom and by the favor of the gods. I have learned that strength without mercy is weakness, and that a king's heart must be as steady as his walls." Under this spirit, he reformed laws and administration. Governors were held accountable for corruption. Farmers received fair access to irrigation. Temples were granted endowments to feed the poor and maintain order. Babylon became not only the seat of empire, but the symbol of a just and balanced world. Religion remained the pulse of daily life. The temples of Marduk-Nabu and Ishtar were filled with offerings. The great festival of Akitu continued each year with renewed grandeur. During these celebrations, Nebuchadnezzar would walk humbly behind the statue of Marduk in procession, reaffirming his service to the gods. His subjects saw in this humility a sign of divine favor, the assurance that their king ruled under heaven's watchful eye. Beyond the city, the empire's provinces enjoyed an unprecedented period of peace. The Phoenician ports hummed with trade. The farmlands of Mesopotamia bloomed. Even the exiled peoples from Judah, though still longing for home, found stability under Babylon's rule. Many of them became traders, artisans, and scholars, contributing to the empire's growing wealth. In this mingling of nations, Babylon became a melting pot of cultures: Assyrian, Chaldean, Aramean, Hebrew, Median, and Persian, all united under the lion banner of Nebuchadnezzar. It was said that no city on earth rivaled Babylon's splendor. At night, the torches along its walls formed a ring of fire visible for miles. By day, its processional roads gleamed with limestone, its markets overflowed with goods, and its palaces dazzled visitors with ivory and gold. The hanging gardens still cascaded in green terraces, and the Ishtar Gate shone like a jewel in the sun. Travelers from Greece, Phoenicia, and Egypt spoke of it in wonder, some doubting that such a city could exist, others claiming it must be the dwelling place of gods. Nebuchadnezzar himself, though surrounded by all this glory, grew quieter with age. He had seen the world's extremes: conquest and loss, pride and humility, madness and restoration. Now, as his hair turned white and his steps slowed, he became more reflective. He spent hours walking the courtyards of his palace, listening to the fountains and the wind in the palm trees. He spoke often of time of destiny and of the smallness of men before the eternal. He continued to rule wisely, but he no longer sought to expand. His ambition had turned inward toward preserving peace and preparing for the future. The younger princes of his house, impatient for glory, sometimes questioned his restraint. But Nebuchadnezzar understood something they did not, that the mightiest empire could crumble not from invasion, but from within. He had built Babylon into the greatest city the world had known, but he knew too that even its walls would one day fall, as all things of earth must. Still he took solace in what he had learned through suffering, that true greatness lies not in conquest, but in balance, not in domination, but in understanding. As the sun set behind Babylon's towers and the sky turned to amber, the king often stood at his window looking out over the land that had been his life's work. The Euphrates glowed like fire beneath the horizon, and the chants of evening prayers drifted through the air. He had seen his empire reach perfection, the pinnacle of human effort, and at last his heart was at peace. In the long chronicles of Babylon, this time would be remembered as its brightest age, when the city of gods and men stood united in splendor, when its king ruled not with pride, but with wisdom. For Nebuchadnezzar, the Lion of Babylon, had at last found what all kings seek, but few ever attain, not immortality through conquest, but harmony between heaven and earth. The final years. The sun was setting on the life of Nebuchadnezzar II. The king who had once shaken the world with war now spent his days in quiet contemplation, walking among the colonnades of his palace or resting in the shade of his hanging gardens. The roar of conquest had faded, the empire was at peace. Babylon thrived, the canals ran full and the towers gleamed with gold in the evening light. Yet for all its beauty, time, that silent and unrelenting conqueror, now crept upon its greatest ruler. Nebuchadnezzar was old, his beard had turned white, his voice slower, his gait deliberate. His eyes, once sharp with command, had softened with memory. He often stood on the palace roof at dusk, gazing across the city he had built, the walls rising like mountain ridges, the ziggurat Etemenanki glowing red in the sunset, the Euphrates winding gently through the heart of his empire. To anyone watching, he looked every bit the eternal king. Yet inside he knew what others did not, that eternity belonged to the gods alone. In his later years, Nebuchadnezzar's thoughts turned increasingly to legacy. The madness that had once overtaken him was long past, but its lesson had never left his heart. He had learned humility in the fields, and that humility now guided his final decisions. He ordered that no more palaces be built in his name, no more conquests undertaken for glory. Instead, he focused on maintenance and restoration, ensuring that the empire he would leave behind would endure after his death. Under his supervision, canals were cleaned and expanded temples repaired, and scribes commissioned to record the laws and achievements of his reign. Thousands of clay tablets were inscribed with records of his projects, lists of rations, inventories of temples, accounts of trade, and decrees for justice. He understood that a king's true monument was not carved in stone, but written in the prosperity of his people. He gathered his family and advisers often. His sons were ambitious, eager to prove themselves as conquerors like their father had once been. But Nebuchadnezzar cautioned them. The sword builds quickly, he told them, but walls endure longer. I have built walls of stone, of law and of faith. Guard them well, for they will protect you when my hand no longer can. His words carried the weight of experience, but youth seldom listens long to wisdom born of patience. In the temples, priests continued to offer sacrifices in his name. The great New Year festival, the XIII, remained the crowning celebration of the calendar. Even in old age, Nebuchadnezzar insisted on performing his part, walking humbly before the statue of Marduk, reaffirming the bond between heaven and Babylon. His subjects watched with reverence as their aged king, supported by attendants, fulfilled his sacred duties. To them he was more than mortal. He was a link in the eternal chain between gods and men. Yet beneath his reverence for Marduk there remained in Nebuchadnezzar a quiet curiosity, a lingering memory of the God of Daniel, the one who had revealed his dreams and restored his mind. In private he sometimes spoke of this deity not as a rival to Marduk, but as another aspect of the divine order. There is, he once said to a scribe, a power that moves unseen, ruling all kingdoms and the hearts of men. I have known it, I have fallen before it. Such reflections never appeared in official inscriptions, but they lived in the whispers of those close to him, a testament to the king's evolving understanding of faith. Babylon, under his mature rule, reached a level of peace rarely seen in the ancient world. Trade continued to enrich the city. Foreign envoys came to bow before him, bringing gifts from far-off lands, silk from distant Asia, lapis lazuli from Bactria, and incense from the Red Sea coasts. Scholars debated in the temples, artisans crafted wonders, and astronomers charted the skies with growing precision. The empire seemed eternal, the golden head of civilization, just as the dream had foretold. Yet even as he strengthened his empire, Nebuchadnezzar knew its limits. He had seen too many kingdoms rise and fall to believe that Babylon's greatness would last forever. He had defeated Assyria, humbled Egypt, and outlived his rivals, but he understood that one day another power would come, just as Daniel's prophecy had said. He could not stop that future, but he could ensure that when Babylon's time ended, it would be remembered as the crown of the ancient world. In his final years, he spent much time in his gardens. The terraces were as lush as ever, filled with the sound of water and the scent of cedar. There he would often sit beside Queen Amethyst, his lifelong companion. She had grown old beside him, her once dark hair now silver, but her presence remained a comfort. Together they would speak of the past, of the mountains, of her homeland, of the years of conquest of the city they had made bloom from dust. Sometimes he would smile faintly and say, "You longed for the hills, my queen, so I gave you mountains of my own." It was in these gardens that he began to dictate what would become his final inscriptions. He spoke not of victories, but of gratitude. Gratitude for life, for knowledge, and for the gods who had both humbled and exalted him. One surviving tablet reads, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, who have seen both greatness and despair, praise the King of heaven, whose works are truth and whose ways are justice. Those who walk in pride, he is able to humble." These words, humble, solemn, and reflective, marked the end of a life that had traversed every peak of human ambition and every valley of human frailty. They were not the words of a conqueror, but of a man who had finally found peace. As age pressed heavier upon him, Nebuchadnezzar withdrew further from public life. He appointed his son Amel-Marduk as heir, and spent his last seasons within the palace overlooking the Euphrates. His days were filled with silence and ritual. Each morning he offered prayers to Marduk and the other gods. Each evening he listened to the songs of his court musicians, soft hymns that drifted through the open windows as the city glowed beneath the stars. Then one night the music ceased, the torches dimmed. The king, now frail and weary, lay upon his bed, surrounded by priests and family. As the first light of dawn touched the ziggurat summit, Nebuchadnezzar II, builder of Babylon, conqueror of nations, servant of the gods, breathed his last. The city mourned for days. Bells rang from the temples, priests recited prayers, and the people gathered in the streets to lay offerings of grain and flowers. The Lion of Babylon had fallen, but his roar echoed still in the stones of the Ishtar gate, in the terraces of the gardens, in the clay tablets bearing his name. His reign had lasted more than 4 decades. Under his rule, Babylon had become not merely a city, but an idea, the pinnacle of what human will guided by divine order, could achieve. And though time would eventually bring new kings and new empires, none would match the legend of Nebuchadnezzar the Great. The river flowed on beneath the walls, carrying the reflection of a city that seemed timeless. Yet even as the waters moved toward the sea, they whispered the truth that Nebuchadnezzar had come to understand, that all greatness, however vast, must one day return to the silence from which it rose, echoes of a golden empire. Centuries have passed since Nebuchadnezzar's voice last echoed through the halls of Babylon, yet his presence lingers in stone, in story, and in the imagination of those who still speak his name. Time has carried away the dust of armies, the crowns of kings, and the splendor of empires, but the legend of Babylon and its mighty ruler endures like a flame sheltered against the wind. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, the empire he had built began to change. His son, Amel-Marduk, inherited a kingdom vast and rich, but not the steady hand or wisdom of his father. The unity that Nebuchadnezzar had forged through discipline and faith began to loosen. Ambition stirred among governors and generals, and the peace that had graced the land slowly gave way to intrigue. Within a few short years, the stability of Babylon began to falter. The great empire continued for several decades more, ruled by successors who tried to uphold its grandeur, but could not match Nebuchadnezzar's vision. The power that had once radiated from the Euphrates began to wane. Far to the east, a new force was rising, the Persians led by Cyrus the Great, a conqueror whose name would soon sweep across the same lands that Nebuchadnezzar had once ruled. In 539 BCE, just one lifetime after the death of Babylon's greatest king, the city fell. Without battle or destruction, the Persians entered its gates. The priests of Marduk opened them willingly, perhaps seeing in Cyrus a new instrument of divine will. Babylon, the gate of the gods, passed into history not with fire and ruin, but with silence and surrender. Yet even as the empire faded, the memory of Nebuchadnezzar refused to die. His works had been too great, his story too vast to vanish. The ziggurat Etemenanki still towered over the plains, its shadow stretching like a bridge between heaven and earth. The walls he built, the canals he dug, and the gardens he raised stood for generations as reminders of a time when one man had made the desert bloom. Travelers from Greece and beyond would later wander through the ruins, astonished at what they found. Some claimed the walls were so wide that chariots could race upon them. Others spoke of the hanging gardens, how water had once flowed from terrace to terrace, and trees had grown in the sky. Poets and historians alike wove tales of Nebuchadnezzar's might, his madness, and his faith. Herodotus, centuries later, would call Babylon the greatest city the earth has ever known. But it was not only in history that his name endured. In the sacred writings of the Judeans, the very people he had conquered and carried into exile, Nebuchadnezzar appeared again and again, his story transformed from that of an enemy into that of a lesson. He became a symbol of pride, brought low of power, humbled before the eternal. To them his life proved that even the greatest of men must bow before the unseen will that governs all things. The God who had revealed his dreams had also written his story into the pages of faith. Thus, Nebuchadnezzar lived on in two worlds, in Babylonian memory as the builder of glory, and in Hebrew scripture as the instrument of divine justice. Few men in history have bridged such extremes: conqueror and servant destroyer, and visionary beast and penitent. His legacy, like the city he built, was both magnificent and complex, shimmering with contradictions. Over the centuries, the sands of time buried Babylon. The Euphrates shifted its course, the walls crumbled, and the ziggurat fell into ruin. The hanging gardens vanished into legend, their very existence debated by scholars and dreamers alike. But beneath the soil, the foundations of Nebuchadnezzar's world remained bricks, stamped with his name, fragments of tablets bearing his decrees, and the faint outlines of the streets he once walked. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when archaeologists unearthed the ruins of Babylon, they found his mark everywhere. Thousands of clay bricks, each inscribed with the same proud dedication: "I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the restorer of the temples and walls of my fathers, the one whom Marduk has called to rule the world." His name, written in cuneiform, had survived where empires had not. It was as if the earth itself had preserved his story, not in monuments of glory, but in humble bricks, each one bearing witness to the vision of a man who believed he could shape eternity. Today the ruins of Babylon lie quiet under the Iraqi sun. The Euphrates still flows slow and timeless past fields of reeds and broken stone. The Ishtar Gate, once the entrance to paradise on earth, now stands rebuilt in a distant museum, its blue glazed bricks shimmering once more beneath artificial light. The lions, bulls, and dragons still march across its surface, proud symbols of a vanished world. And though the voice of Nebuchadnezzar is long silent, his story continues to whisper through history in the myths of empire, in the echoes of prophecy, in every lesson about pride and humility, ambition and faith. For what remains of a man after his death? Not the armies he led, nor the gold he gathered, nor even the palaces he built. What endures are the stories, the tales told around fires and in temples, passed down through the generations. Nebuchadnezzar became one of those stories, the king who built Babylon, who dreamed of statues and kingdoms, who lost his mind and found his soul. And though his city crumbled, the idea of Babylon did not die with it. To the prophets it became a symbol of worldly splendor and human arrogance. To poets and philosophers it stood for civilization itself, the eternal struggle between order and chaos, pride and humility, man and the divine. As night falls over the ruins, the wind moves through the broken stones, whispering across the same plains where the king once walked. The sound is faint, but if one listens closely, it seems to carry a voice not of conquest, but of remembrance. All that I built was dust and fire, yet what I learned endures beyond stone. The might of kings fades, but wisdom once earned belongs to eternity. And so ends the story of Nebuchadnezzar II, builder of Babylon, conqueror, of nations, dreamer of destiny, and servant of the eternal. His empire fell, but his legend became timeless. The walls he raised are gone, but his legacy remains not in the grandeur of his city, but in the lesson his life left behind, that no empire, no king, no dream of glory lasts forever. Only the truth endures. Only the soul remembers. And somewhere in the quiet of the Mesopotamian night, beneath the stars that once guided his builders and priests, the river still flows, carrying with it the echoes of a golden empire.